Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's Boomerang Labs webinar, breaking down the opportunities, risks, pros, and cons of artificial intelligence. We're joined by Sophia Withers, co-founder at EcoGen Technologies, and Dr. Gareth Kennedy, Specialist Director, Data and AI at Deloitte Australia, who will lead us on this deep dive into the world of AI. But first, I'm Allison, and as Boomerang Labs communications manager, I literally wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you a bit about Boomerang and this series. So we're Australia's first startup accelerator focused specifically on circular economy founders. And while most of our programs are more intensive, we wanted to have these free webinars to provide learning opportunities on topics of particular interest. So next month we'll be discussing designing in waste and reframing product design around material recycling. And so that's going to be on the 30th of April. So you can check out our events page on our website, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter to get all the latest news from us. We do also have those more in-depth programs for startups at all stages. So please do check out our website if you're interested in those or know someone who might be. And I am joining this morning from Gunditjmara country, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live and work, and pay our respect to elders past and present. And now I am going to turn it over to the people that you are actually here to see. So Sophia and Gareth, if you'd like to take it away.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Alison. I'm delighted to be here this morning and discussing something so paramount and important. I have a mosaic of experience dabbling from fintech, clean tech, renewable energy, blockchain for social impact, many failed startups. And basically my experience and my curiosity of this arena stemmed from reading the book called 21 Lessons of the 21st Century. And Yuri Noah Harari says that the three most pressing problems facing humanity is one, nuclear warfare, ecological damage, and the rise of AI. So I'm really looking forward to delving into two of those problems today. And I've known Gareth for about 5-6 years now. So yeah, really excited to be here. I'll just share my screen and we can get started with the presentation. Okay, can everyone see that screen, please? Wonderful. Okay, so as mentioned, today's discussion, we're going to focus on AI and its environmental impacts. What we have recently realized in the past few years is that there is a huge issue of AI negatively impacting the environment. And as such, we've quantified that information. We're going to be having an interactive discussion. We welcome you to have drop any questions in the chat box. And basically, we're going to discuss, aside of AI's environmental impacts, how will AI actually be the catalyst to decarbonising the energy supply? We're going to focus on two key examples, one of which is in the clean energy industry, and most specifically the grid. And secondly, we're going to discuss case studies, examples of how AI is disrupting business models and improving efficiency. The last part of this discussion will be more forward-thinking, and we're going to focus on how we can actually take the good and minimize the bad, and how you as an investor, startup founder, climate enthusiast, or student can have an impact as well. So I've introduced myself today, and I'm going to hand over to Gareth to explain his experience and his knowledge in this area.
So thanks for joining us. Originally I was a scientist. So originally my PhD was in astrophysics, but it was always in sort of computational astrophysics. So we used we're responsible for a lot of energy burn ourselves, right? So we were solving particularly complex problems, and we were using a lot of AI to do that. I did this in Australia, of course, as you can tell by my accent, also from Spain and in China. So we had this very large GPU cluster in Beijing that we were monitoring. We were using it to basically to look at the center of galaxies and things like that. We should have been using it for Bitcoin mining because we would have made a lot more money that way. But it's exactly the same sort of hardware that's now used, all these GPUs and NVIDIA, anyone who has stocks in them will know about this. They're the same machines that are actually used to actually solve all the AI equations now, right? And to actually sort of implement those. And in that role, I actually have also been, grew up a team inside Deloitte Data and AI, for basically safeguarding AI. So for implementing AI, deploying it so that it actually does live decision making, things like that, and make sure that it's got safe rails around the side of it, so we know what it shouldn't do, right? Which is quite pertinent to this. So that's enough about me. Sophie.
Amazing, thank you, Gareth. So as we can see, Gareth has worked on sort of the dark and the lighter side of AI. And essentially, just to talk to some of the research that I've conducted in the space was more around blockchain. This was in the understanding of how blockchain is disrupting business models in the social impact sphere, which then led me to understanding different pieces of technology such as fintech and clean tech. So let's get straight into it. We're going to set the scene here, and let's take a zoom out approach and remind ourselves exactly what sort of age we're currently within. And that is the data age. So the data age is characterized by the acceleration is the key word, and this is since the Industrial Revolution. This will be the biggest change yet seen on planet Earth, and it will certainly be larger than the first Industrial Revolution. So an interesting point here, or just a reminder about today's discussion, is that the difference between data we process as humans and data that a machine processes is that this commonality is that every time you collect data, you improve your learning, you improve your optimizations, take actions, and through this loop, you continuously learn and improve to the point that you are optimal. Now, the difference is that a computer utilizes electricity to transmit information, and of course, that has a detrimental impact on the environment. Now, we appreciate that not all listeners are well versed in the realm of AI. So we do welcome you to think about what's your perception of AI, what's your understanding of AI, and we do welcome you to put that in the chat below. And we do have a literal example of what AI is defined as, but I might hand it over to you, Gareth, to describe what your interpretation is of AI and how that has evolved over the years.
Not sure if this is going to go deep enough. Not sure if it's going to go deep enough.
Well, we can't go too deep on it. I mean, we can break out the equations if you want, but so informally, you can think of AI as basically a black box that takes in a whole lot of inputs, does some stuff to it, and then generates some outputs on top of that, right? Now, the key difference between an AI and sort of the older machine learning ones and all that, I mean, it depends on how you use it, but an AI one of its main things is that it actually learns over time as well, right? So it is good at taking something where there's only incomplete data and sort of extrapolating from that, but then it actually has to have some sort of feedback loop inside there that actually keeps it going through there. Right, so some sort of mechanism of feedback. Otherwise, it tends to sort of get stuck in the mud, if you like. Right, so and the definition of AI changes depending on each one. So, for example, the EU AI Act defines AI as any automated decision-making process. Right, so that could literally be an if statement, something very, very simple. In other words, right. So, you could imagine it as like a credit scoring thing. That's if male say yes, if female say no. That would be the most biased possible machine you can imagine. Right, so it's still, from a legal perspective, that still counts as an AI, even though from a practicality perspective and a mathematical perspective, it's nowhere near. But anything that sort of mirrors how we sort of take inputs and then decide on something and then do some outputs or surface some data or get some insights, that's loosely defined as an AI. And these days, we've co-opted the word into thinking about generative AI and all sorts of different things, of course. But at its core, it's just something that takes in lots of complex inputs and outputs something that's hopefully of value.
Amazing. And I see, Julian, you said that it doesn't go deep enough, and that's certainly true. I mean, the definition here was from 1955, which is, very long time ago. And should we even be calling it artificial intelligence? There's a lot of literature and books that suggest we could call it alternative intelligence. Gareth, what would be, or anyone from the audience, how would you better describe the phrase?
I think that often when we think of AI, we think of the actual end state, like a general intelligence. We've all watched Terminator too many times. So we think straight away to that. So anytime anyone says AI, we think, robot killers that can think autonomously, have a willpower of their own, or controlled by Skynet or whatever, which has a willpower. But what we've actually got now is we usually define it as narrow AI. In other words, it's something that's trained on just this very narrow 1,000 or so features to give output that is this a cat or is it a dog? Right? That kind of very, very narrow use case. It's not something that can go, well, we've recently become ones that are a bit more generalized, right? So things like the stuff that came out of DeepMind, so AlphaGo and all those ones, where you can train it on a game. But even then, it needs to see trillions of examples of people playing games to actually get it. Right now, while I was training AIs, coincidentally, at the same time, I was training human babies, my own kids, in other words, and they can extrapolate off a lot less information. You show a kid 5 pictures of a cat, and then that will basically be enough. They've now got the concept of cat fine. And if you put the cat in a Santa suit, they know it's a cat in a Santa suit. A machine doesn't do that. So they're not intelligent by a long way. They're sort of an automated thing for dealing with complexity and outputting something, which is quite useful because humans kind of are not always the best at that aspect of things. We can't take in that many inputs.
Cool. So let's just go into, before we go into the quantification of how much of an issue this is, let's look at some use cases of AI in the environmental sector. And the reason for this is there's many different branches of AI, most notably machine learning, deep neural networks. But this slide and our discussion here is to help you understand some of the use cases. So for example, in the case of deep neural networking, there's many use cases where we can actually identify the mass of icebergs, and so much so that this is 10,000 times 10,000 times quicker than a human can process. We have drones equipped with AI technologies that can fight deforestation and poaching. And I'd just like to ask you, Gareth, can you briefly describe the differences between some of the most prominent types of AI and examples you've seen in this industry?
Yeah, sure. So all of these ones in the environmental sector, they're all ones that are, again, dealing with huge amount of complexity, right? So, for example, the air quality monitoring one down there, we were doing this actually, when I was working at Australia Post, we were putting this together as well. We had a whole lot of sensors on vans, and we were putting that together to see if we can get complex signals that we could then use and give that information across to, like the Environmental Protection Agency, or whichever the department they're called these days. They change their name every year. So we could always give that data across to them so they could then track at a high resolution level where particular pollutants were coming from particular places, right? So all that requires a huge amount of complexity inside there. And the same with any sort of like the natural disaster or any sort of like weather prediction, for example. You've got fluid dynamic models giving you the larger scope ones, but then if you want to get down to that granularity, you can actually use an AI to really get it down so that you can know that, well, it's likely that, say, a flood or a heavy storm or something is going to hit this particular point. Right. And then that's going to have ramifications for insurance companies, for example, and things like that. So they already have a lot of this sort of bits integrated into their systems to try work out how to effectively price things. And what we're now seeing is that a lot of these models are actually saying, well, these ones are they're so prone to natural disasters that it's actually going to be a real problem to insure them. So then you actually have to put in the policies inside there and say, well, it's unethical not to insure people. So we have to work out some way to factor that into our prices, lower their prices from what should objectively be true, just based on maybe they had no choice but to buy in that particular region for socioeconomic reasons. So it's this really complex balancing act. And without that sort of dealing with all that complexity and surfacing that up to a human, we don't really stand a chance of being able to make any good decisions. So many of these use cases actually fall into that sort of that prediction and that complexity in dealing with that. And that's what AI does very nicely.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're now going to turn the topic of this discussion onto what your thoughts are as the listener or the viewer. We have 3 questions here, and this is where we start to quantify the issue And this is the environmental issue that AI has. And this is from its computing. So if you take a look at the questions here, if you'd like to please jot them down, write them down, and please put them in the chat so we can have a look. Question number 1 is, how much of a percentage has data center electricity consumption grown annually in recent years? So that is a percentage. Take a wild guess. Data centers, cryptocurrencies, and AI has accounted for a percentage of global power demand, and this is in 2022. Take a guess. And thirdly, MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, reported that the cloud now has a larger carbon footprint than which industry? For example, retail, automotive. So please do take a guess, and I'll just give you a few seconds to do so. Okay, we have a guess of 15%, 5% for the data centers and retail. Okay, and Mariam, we have 10 to 15% for answer number 1, 100% from Candice, and automobile was the industry, 8%. Okay, interesting. All right, so feel free to have a think. Okay, Das, thank you. We have a 50% guess increase. Secondly, 5%, and 3 airline. Okay, we are getting some correct answers. Transportation is predicted. Thank you, 500%, and 15% in transport. Okay, it looks like the consensus believes it's the transport industry. And arguably, you're not wrong, but it's not as large as that category entirely. So let's take a look at the actual answers here. So annually, 20 to 40%, we can see an increase in electricity consumption. And this is set to double by 2026. And to understand this on a global scale, this would match the electricity consumption of Japan as a whole, which is extremely staggering. And we already know that CO2 emissions are rising exponentially. Number 2 is data centers, cryptocurrencies, and AI accounted for 2% of global power demand. It's actually great that we've managed to guess significantly higher, but luckily it's not as large as 30% or so. And then the industry that the cloud has now surpassed in terms of carbon footprint is actually the airline industry. So when we think of CO2 emissions, I don't know about you, but I often think of the airline industry, the automobile industry, but actually the cloud, the industry of the cloud is a very large contributor. So here, let's actually look at how does AI contribute negatively to the environment. So we just talked about data centers. Now, data centers utilize an extensive amount of water and electricity. As such, computing anything does generate waste heat, which needs to be removed to avoid machines from overheating. The cooling is performed by air or water, and where water is more efficient, it can be problematic for data centers in deserts, even though it's good for solar. So to quantify this, the typical data center uses 25 million litres a year, which is the same as about 250 people. And a large hyperscaler data center, which such as Google, uses 30 times this as well. And not only that, but if you think of the entire life cycle of generating AI, it's extremely critical metal dependent, much like battery manufacturing. Many of the critical metals to build the chips are needed for the green energy transition, such as lithium, aluminium, copper, etc. We have a note here about the cloud computing being increased exponentially, largely due to generative AI. So, Gareth, can you talk to us about how and why this is increasing so rapidly in recent years?
Sure. So unless people have been living in a rock under a rock in Mars for the last year, you've probably heard of generative AI, in particular about ChatGPT and all those ones there. And I'm sure most of you have probably actually played with it at one stage, right? So it's quite a fun little tool. You give it a little prompt, you see what it comes out with. For example, you can get it to generate images, you can get it to generate text or stories and all that. It's quite useful for a lot of different things. My 7-year-old son loved it. He broke it in about 3 seconds, amusingly. But what powers it behind there is actually about 1.7 trillion different parameters, right? So it's basically a very large neural network, which from a mathematical point of view is a whole lot of weights and biases. So each of those is just a number. It's a number that needs to be stored. And you need to optimize that by sort of shifting them by some various complex algorithms, which have been around for a while in mathematics anyway. But you actually sort of put all those together, and then you end up with this it takes a long time to train these to actually be able to do something useful, right? And you train on particular things. In this case, they trained it on effectively all the text in the internet, which is why it randomly puts out bits from Wikipedia or from Times Magazine or anything, right? So that process took about 25,000 GPUs to train. It took about 100 days to get the first version of ChatGPT, right? And each of the new ones takes a little bit longer. It's got a bit more parameters and all that kind of thing. So it's actually increasing inside there. So that's just for the ones that these large companies did. Now, then if you take it as an organization, you take one of those off the shelf ones, and then you do additional training on top of it, that's even more GPU power that you're using. I say GPU because that's actually the fastest way to train these, and it's still the best value for money, I guess you could say, compared to using a CPU, which is a standard one that you've got in your laptops, right? So GPUs are sort of tailor-made to solve these equations. So it uses a huge amount of energy during that training cycle. So in some of these cases, you're looking at about 1,000 households equivalent, things like that, to train one of these models, right? And then when you actually when you're doing the prediction, each time you sort of send one out, every time you ask a prompt, it uses a tiny bit of electricity, runs for on average, about 6 seconds roughly for some of these ones. And then it gives you a response. During that 6 seconds, it's also running a whole lot of stuff on these GPUs in there as well. And that's using a lot less. But then when you think about how many prompts we have per day, so ChatGPT, I think, is getting about 10 million prompts per day typically. And that works out to be about the same energy as, like the 100 or so households that you're actually doing inside there as well. And that's just for one company, right? So we're using this inside a lot of ones. So you can imagine that all that together, and all the every company's been trying, every executive, I can speak from personal experience, has been trying to invest in this and to tout how much they're doing AI and use it for everything and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's been a huge uptake in GPU use because of this.
Absolutely. And Gareth, just to turn the attention on more the FANGs, or should I say the MANGs, the Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, their cloud computing increased twofold between 2017 and 2022. And generally speaking, I know that policy and governments have struggled to regulate the corporation tax side of things. And without going too political on this discussion today, should we be putting our eyes on them and their contribution, or how much of it should the FANGs and Amazon, etc., actually be attributable to this? Obviously, they're some of the biggest players in this industry. So why are we not focusing more of our attention on their specific contributions?
In many ways, so there was that old phrase, which was, like, data is the new oil, right? In many respects, compute is the new natural gas. I don't know, I just made that up, but it's been recorded, so now it's on record. All right, so we're the ones actually buying that resource, right? So if I think of it more as a supply and demand one. Yes, the FANGs have got the massive data centers and all that kind of stuff, right? So if you want to do a startup, for example, like many in the audience have, you're probably on AWS or GCP or on Azure, right? All of those have data centers. You need to have those located typically in your own region, right? So if you've got regulatory compliance issues where you have to have the data being stored in Australia, for example, then you have to have the data center located in here. So therefore, your Googles and Amazons and that will have to actually build a data center inside Melbourne or Sydney or wherever. And then you basically tap into that. So we need that resource. So we can't exactly do without it. So they're sort of responding to the market in that respect, and they're building more data centers where they think they can get the money from it from their perspective. They want people to use compute. So we have to be a bit wise in the way we use that resource. And often we might have a choice. So I personally use a lot of these data centers in that myself. And if I don't need to keep the data inside Australia, I'll actually there's a particular region in Google Cloud, for example, in US Central, where they have the lower CO2 emissions. So I'll actually base all my loads inside there. So at least it won't be as bad as if I were to do it in, say, Sydney, because on those particular ones, the CO2 emissions there are based on brown coal from our fire plant, from our coal fire power plants. So there are some choices we can make as consumers to actually sort of do this one a bit better. So it's, remember that the FANGs are basically responding to what we demand, right? That's
Yes,
how they make their money.
absolutely. Okay, I'm just going to open the floor. Does anyone have any questions at this point in time? Then please do ask away. All right, okay, so moving on to just a deeper look as to what stage of AI development generally causes the largest amount of CO2 emissions. Now, there's quite a lot of information on this slide. You don't need to read every bullet point, but what I will ask you to cast your attention to is the left-hand side, where we have a general process flow of AI development generally. Now, of course, this would be fine-tuned to different applications and use cases. But as you can actually see, we have 4 key phases, and at present, the training phase is the most carbon intensive. So a study in 2019 estimated that the carbon footprint of training a single early large language model, an LLM, such as say ChatGPT-2, was about 300,000 kilograms of CO2 emissions, which is around 125 round trip flights between New York and Beijing. So models now have become exponentially bigger, and therefore the training footprints are also increasing proportionally as well. So training AI models remains much more carbon intensive than the use of, say, other phrases. Now talking about the inference phase, such as generative tasks, whether it's text generation, summarizing, image generation and captioning. And actually, this is where we're going to see the shift of where the most CO2 emissions are going to come from. And this is because they're more carbon intensive than discriminative tasks. And other phases of the model life cycle, such as inference, stand to impact the environment just as much. And this is due to the computational resources required to deploy these models at scale. So quantifying the cost of model inference deployment is limited at the moment, but we are going to see a greater need to evaluate the environmental impacts here. And according to AWS, the largest global cloud provider, inference is estimated to make up about 80 to 90% of total machine learning cloud computing demand. Gareth, I'm not sure if you want to speak to any of that, and how, maybe to ask you, how far away are we from this? Is it a matter of months, years? What's your experience as well of where the most CO2 emissions come from in the AI development?
It's an interesting one because for the last couple of years, we have seen most of it in the training phase. But I literally had a client, again, we're sorry for being amazingly vague in the way I speak, but I kind of have to be. We had a client that's actually gone through in the deployment phase, because this particular client had so many, there were so many pings for this particular API and that was running these sort of models. They've now got to the point where it became too expensive to do it on cloud. So they're actually having to go. So previously, the trend for the last decade or so has been to move all your sort of loads and all that kind of thing from on-prem into cloud and then run it more efficiently. And then that takes care of security on that. And it's got a lot of benefits. When you go too far through it, where your computational requirements get too far, in other words, maybe you've got, say, everyone in Australia is pinging you for whatever your service is, right? Then that's where you actually need to have a sort of data center yourself. So they end up in this sort of old school high performance computing one, where you basically have your own server, you have your own cooling systems, you have all that kind of stuff. Cooling systems, by the way, actually use a huge amount of energy in their own right just to cool it down, with water or air conditioning and things like that as well, which generates another impact there as well, especially when you've got to balance that with, say, so back to the example of where some efficient data centers are. Often they're located in sort of desert locations where they've got a lot of sunlight, so you can get a lot of that by renewal by the sun. But then water is an issue there, of course, because you don't exactly have a large supply. So there's a lot of ones where they're using a huge amount of the local water supply just to cool down these data centers. So it's always this balance and all that. So we've started to see, I should say, a few that have come out the other end where they're now in that second phase of your diagram, where most of they're trained a model. They only need to retrain it, say, every month. So they've done the hard work there. And now it's been pinged so often that that's now the main energy use. So we're starting to get that changing, and they're finding that some of their, if anyone's doing a sort of serverless approach in AWS or in GCP or something, for example, then you'll find that those costs actually get quite expensive, like very fast. If it's being pinged repeatedly, it starts if it's a cent each time, and you've got a million customers, it does start adding up. So I think it's going to get into this sort of self-correcting phase where, yes, your model deployment is being used because your product is being used so much. But from your perspective, that's a good thing. From a business perspective, you want people using your product. And then your costs are going to go up. So you're going to find a way to bring that down. And that also means that you're naturally going to try work out a cheaper way to do it, which then means that your CO2 emissions should come down as well. So I think the market forces might come in and help us a little bit there, actually. I'm optimistic though, but who knows?
Brilliant. So we do have a question from a member of the audience. And that question, and whoever asked this, feel free to take yourself off mute, introduce yourself. But basically, the question that we have here is, how concerned are we about the likelihood that future advanced AIs originating from large tech corporations will further empower these entities at the expense of smaller companies by dictating terms? So this is more around power and control. Just before we begin to answer that, if you could please, whoever's asked that question, if you want to take yourself off mute, introduce yourself. Okay, no problem. So yeah, Gareth, I believe that's asking, are we going to see, the power shift increase even more as we with advanced AIs? What's your thoughts on that one?
So I'm a bit cynical when it comes to humans, I guess is the best way to put this, right? So our AIs are still just tools. They don't think for themselves. They're still narrowly focused. They're not going to go Terminator on us anytime soon. Unfortunately, we've still got the old problems of humans and self-interest. Whenever we've got a few oligarchs or something sort of centralizing power in whatever industry it's ever been in the past, we've always had this issue, right? So even with the railways 100 years ago in the initial industrialization phase for America, we had these massive sort of, barons that would appear and that would control massive bits across there, right? And then the solution there was to break them up and all that. And there's already been discussion about this from a policy level about maybe potentially breaking up these large tech companies and all that in the States. So it looks like it's same, but different, I guess you could say, right? So it's a bit of history repeating because we are still just human, really. We haven't done anything particularly new in this respect. So the policies around that will need to adjust and go to this sort of new normal. And yeah, if you were in charge of one of those companies and you get a particular commission from making money off it, or it's sort of a percentage of the profits and all that kind of thing, then you're incentivized to use that advantage, right? So I think that it's quite likely to happen.
Sadly so. On that note as well, we have two other questions. One question is around decentralizing profitable but environmentally harmful AI, which I believe we are going to touch upon in the conclusive remarks. So I might just park that question. Julian, I see that you've asked a question here about any examples. Would you like to take yourself off mute and ask the question? Okay, so Julian.
Sorry, I did make it. Sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's any, if you're aware of any legislation that's been, or moves towards legislation to try and disincentivize bad AI energy consumption.
Absolutely.
Yes. Sophia.
I was just going to say, that's a really good question because we need to see certain examples and sort of signposts. And essentially, we have noted on our slides some impending regulatory advancements, especially in the USA, but I'm not aware of any in Australia at this present moment. But Gareth, would you like to speak to?
No, I'm not aware of any in Australia, nor am I aware of any particular attention being put to sort of starting the drafting process for Australia. Australia, we tend to be a bit slower when it comes to regulatory movements, basically, right? So So I've been following a lot of the EU AI Act and how that actually influences inside there. And Australia is typically about a year behind on that one. I guess it takes us a long time to turn the photocopier on. So what we're seeing in America is probably where Australia is going to go in about a year or something. And in America at the moment, they're still quite watered down. So they're sort of like more in the advisory, guideliney sort of language than they are in anything strong. So it's still very early days.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. So we'll move on to where we can see AI playing a huge role in decarbonising the energy supply as a whole. We appreciate you been viewing these slides for quite a while now, so we will move to the Q&A session after these segments. So essentially, if we look at the grid, it is undergoing the most rapid transformation of its time. And we're talking about the electrical grid. And essentially, how many of you own an electric vehicle, or you have a neighbour that has a fancy battery in the backyard? Well, we've now gone from being consumers to now prosumers, and this is causing immense complexity at the grid. Now, traditionally, energy always followed the load. So if you think about it, physics always wins. We had energy being generated, goes to the transmission lines, and then goes to the distribution level. Well, at the distribution level, we're seeing the largest amount of complexity. And this is due to a number of different factors, notably placed on the slide to the left here. So there's two key drivers that we can identify having a significant impact on the grid. And one is the deep decarbonisation of the electricity system. Solar batteries and natural energy are stochastic, which means they're difficult to predict. It's not always going to be sunny, and we don't know when everyone needs to specifically have the energy. And two is the increased penetration of distributed energy resources at the grid edge. So all of this change at the distribution level requires essentially AI to help and assist with managing those autonomous operations and all of the different inputs, and as such, the complex modeling required. So much so, AI has the propensity to actually smooth out the energy being interrupted. And not only that, if you think of the example of in Victoria, we had 500,000 houses and businesses without access to energy just shy of a month ago. And there's speculation that this was down to two key reasons, one of which is the rapid shutting down of coal power plants, and two is freak weather accidents as well. So these things are likely to occur again in the future as we transition the grid to renewables. Now, another use case as well of how we're going to see AI being an increasingly important puzzle to the energy supply piece is in the sustainable decision making. So Gareth, can you please speak to some examples in your experience of how decision making has provided sustainable solutions?
Sure. So in my day job, I've dealt with a lot of industry leaders and business leaders and government and things like that. Not just here, but also in China to make things a bit more interesting. That's where I actually went from academia into AI. Hence, Sophia's comment about I've seen the sort of dark side as well as the light, I guess you could say, on this one. So if you can imagine any sort of dodgy sort of use cases, chances are I witnessed it myself. So in this case here, what we've got is actually like AI playing with its strengths. So it's dealing with the complexity and it's bringing it down into something we can make our minds up on, right? So we see this sort of thing play out in a lot of different ways, right? So if you've got a complex system, so previously I was at Australia Post and we had the very large sort of network of logistics network of where to move things. I was there during lockdown, which made it quite amusing. I'm based in Melbourne, so hence I still haven't left this room. It's been years now. So we actually have you've got this very large system where you can move people around there, you can move parcels through particular distribution centers, all that kind of thing. It's an extremely complex system, much more than what a human can actually deal with in their minds, right? We can typically have about, say, maximum 10 things in our heads at once and then make a decision based on that. A machine can actually have thousands and thousands of things inside there, quickly process it and then surface it, but it lacks understanding of what's going on. So humans and machines working together is a really good sweet spot. And that's where you can have the machines making those things together and giving us a few simple options. Option A is do this particular, maybe set up a factory for producing nickel or refining nickel, for example, over here or over there, or do nothing and delay the decision for 3 years, right? And then what are the ramifications for each of those decisions? And then surfacing that up to humans. So this analyzing the complexity, and remember, these systems don't exist in isolation. My choice of where to set up a factory, for example, depends on supply chain issues. It depends on weather conditions. It depends on where maybe I actually have the choice of overseas. Maybe if I set it up in Indonesia, there's a lot of issues with setting up nickel mining in Indonesia, for example, compared to Australia, but it's much cheaper. So, you can actually have all these different balances inside there. And then a human needs to actually choose which of those options inside there. So this is going to be a really big one going forward, because so far LO executives have had relatively easy decisions to do. In other words, there's always been like a good decision and then some that are not as good. We're going to be coming into an age where it's basically we choose the least bad option. There is going to be no choice we can have that is perfect, right? So you need to have a way to actually sort of go, right, I'm choosing option A because of blah, blah, blah. That means not only is it the best decision to make effectively and quickly, it's also something you can back up with data when your shareholders or regulators or something come knocking a year later asking why you did blah. So I think this gives us a lot of sort of power, if you like, to actually make the right decisions as promptly as possible. And anyone who's looking at environmental issues knows that we need speed right now. We do not need to dither for another few decades.
Thank you, Gareth. Okay, so moving on to, you've touched upon we're going to have to make the least bad option, but how do we actually take the good and minimize the bad as well? In terms of your experience, Gareth, I know you have some thoughts on generative AI, and we can talk about the utility of AI specifically. What are your thoughts on how we can actually minimize the bad here?
Yeah. So there's actually quite a lot of things that we can do, right? So, and it also depends on who we are, in other words, right? So we've got a fair few founders and things like that in here. Let's assume that some people are doing the computation ones and they're making choices about which services to use and what to use for what and all that kind of thing, right? So I mentioned before that choosing a data center that's actually got low CO2 emissions and all that, right? So if you've got to choose between AWS, between A and B, choose the one that's the best for the environment. Often it's actually the cheapest as well. So, win-win. Another one is sort of choosing what tool to use, what technology. So you mentioned generative AI before, and it was hilarious from a very dark humor sensitive sort of way. Last year in particular, when you had this massive hype wave coming up with ChatGPT coming out, literally every executive wanted it straight away. Didn't matter what for. So often they were using a generative AI where literally an if statement, which would cost you nothing and take a fraction of a second or a fraction of a second to actually implement, often that would be sufficient, but they wanted to use this just so they could say that they were using it, right? That's a huge waste of electricity, like just objectively just a wasteful one. Now, generative AI has got some great use cases, right? It's extremely good at taking a whole lot of text and making that, basically refining it down, for example, or taking a small amount of text and then refining it up, right? And then expanding it up. So it's very good for getting through legalese, for example, which is often a big problem in environmental stuff. The regulations, honestly, they're supposed to be in English. I can't read them. They're just so much legal waffle inside there that you need something to condense it down. So generative AI has got some great use cases in there, and I've seen really good ones used, but we don't need to use it for absolutely everything. It's just a waste of computing time. So there's that one there you can actually do. In terms of if you're an investor, for example, then it's slightly different. Ask questions, right? This is one thing that we always had a lot in consulting. It's just like, why are you doing this? Why are they doing that? Why are they using generative AI for this one there? Why have they thought of another, what's the impact of what they're doing on the environment, right? Just simply ask questions. Also, one thing that I noticed in Australia, apologies, but given that I am Australia, I'm allowed to make fun of us. We're often extremely risk averse. We don't take chances on the new technology. We don't invest in R&D. Our R&D spending, for example, as a country has been dropping consistently for decades. We're now, I think we're about 2 or 3% of GDP less than what the OECD average is, just off the top of my head, right? So we're actually really underspending. So investors, we can try to choose the ones that are actually taking a chance. Yes, they might fail. That's what investing is, right? That's what venture capital is meant to be. That's what capitalism is meant to be. Take a chance on those ones there. And even from an individual citizen point of view, we can actually start pushing our government to actually invest in these technologies, right? At the moment, if a government wants to get re-elected, they have to rock up to places in high vis, and that's enough to get them votes, right? We need them to actually start going, well, maybe they need green viz, I don't know. But let's get them to actually start investing where we actually have strengths in Australia, right? We've got excellent research universities. We've got really good people here. We've got great resources here, human and, of course, mineral resources. We've also got a huge amount of renewable energy resources here, far more than most countries. We are the lucky country after all, but we haven't really used a lot of that luck properly yet. So,
Yes,
yeah.
and Gareth as well, in terms of policy, obviously policy is a huge enabler to putting this industry in the right trajectory. But if we don't have policymakers and members of parliament who understand the technology, obviously they would have advisors and they would consult. But do you think there's room for improvement in terms of policy leaders themselves understanding this technology and understanding the industry?
Yeah, definitely. And it's actually relatively easy for them, right? So in the case of AI and AI regulations around it, we're not 26 or whatever it is million people sitting in the middle of an island with no one else around us. There's a whole other, like the rest of the world has already looked into these problems, and they've looked into it at scale and all that. And they've come up with a lot of solutions as well. So look outwards. Australia has a tendency to just keep on looking inwards a bit too much. So look at what other people are doing with this. Look at the AI Environmental Impacts Act that the US is currently drawing up, right? So look at all of those sort of ones like that. Look at that's the right direction we want to head into. And then from a business perspective, we can look at these as well. And we go, well, we know that our politicians and regulators are slow, but they'll eventually land somewhere there. So we can prepare for that now. Right? We can start putting in the safeguards around our AI models. We can make sure that if we're getting something that does decide on some complex problem and all of that we need for our businesses, make sure that it's actually got suitable guardrails and make sure that it's got like an emissions guardrail inside there, such that if a new model goes forward which makes a decision on whatever it is, that's not going to increase our CO2 emissions. It always has to decrease it, right? That's things you can actually implement right now, knowing that the regulations will come. It might take a year or two, never know with Australia, but it will eventually get there. So at least that vision from outside Australia can provide us guidance and more business certainty than we can often get from our policymakers here.
Right. Okay. And that's very timely and on the discussion point of what example attempts we can see of balancing the good and the bad. And Julian, this comes back to your question about good examples on the global scale. I'm conscious of time, so we'll just sort of briefly go over this. In terms of big tech, we can see advancements in at least their energy conservation. In terms of regulation, we are seeing democratic bills, and the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures has been developing reporting systems that can track impacts on nature. And in terms of innovation, in terms of renewable energy, nuclear fusion would completely change the game. And in terms of that as well, we can see investment into this space, and AI will be a critical part of that in being able to precisely deploy the magnets where they're needed. So we can see some examples, especially in the EU, the US. Do you have any other examples that come to mind, Gareth?
Yeah, so someone mentioned before about DeepMind and all that as well, and in the innovation space. So DeepMind was originally just playing effectively. That's the way most research gets done, right? So you make a new model, and they were doing it for games, and then a lot of the technology behind that actually got used for AlphaFold, right? And AlphaFold, for those who aren't familiar with it, is basically a whole lot of protein folding, which is a very computationally intensive problem. Historically, it was a simulation problem, and it's where all the atoms move, and then you can actually get it so you can design particular drugs and various things like that. Right. So, and various vaccines and things. AlphaFold was able to speed up that process a lot and recommend new proteins and new ways of doing things and new drugs based on just analyzing huge quantities of data, being able to sort of predict where these are going to go without doing the even more energy intensive simulations. right? From a self-interest point of view, we're looking at doing this in electrochemistry as well. So I was actually down at Monash on Monday where we were discussing this very problem. So there is a lot of innovation we can do with AI combined with simulation, all that, to actually really push forward a lot of green ideas. So we were doing this in electrochemistry for green chemistry, looking at different biosensors and various things like that. So there's a huge amount you can do with innovation in this. It's a fantastic tool. We've just got to make sure that we wield it wisely.
Absolutely, and thank you for some of the comments. Any of the questions that haven't gone unnoticed, I have saved them. And we have a comment there from Daniel. Would you like to add that comment by taking yourself off mute, or I can read that one out?
I was just to quickly add, like, we're talking about a lot of the bigger innovations at like infrastructure level scale, but there's also opportunities at a smaller scale. For example, DeepMind does battery optimizations for Android devices. On an individual device, that's not a huge savings, but when you scale that across billions of devices across the world, it actually does have a meaningful change on the grid demand. So just also worth looking at, like, what small changes can we make kind of across the board, because they do add up.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And Mariam as well.
Yeah, sorry, it was just a comment. I think we were talking about DeepMind and what it can be used for, also in area of drugs and biologics that are right now kind of giving a huge, it's a huge leap step in comparing to the traditional way of chemical-based drugs. And it's just the beginning. But I have a question in the round, or maybe Gareth, how can we protect ourselves or as an organization if we are using AI for decision making, for example? How can we protect ourselves from bias that is built in an AI? What
Excellent
are
question.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for that one. That really goes to literally what I was doing in Deloitte. Is I built a team up to do that very thing, right? So we actually had it where we would implement it so whenever you have an AI, you actually have it sort of in a development environment. You develop something, right? A quick little toy model. It goes through a testing phase and then it goes live where it's actually actioning on people. And that's where the biases can actually, start impacting people in a negative way. What we did, and we did this is it's called AI Bricks if people want to Google it later through Deloitte. And this particular one would actually it would bake it into the MLOps process itself. In other words, that deployment process, it would, in that testing phase, it would make sure that it's actually not biased, and it would monitor those as a function of time, because we know that what we think isn't biased now may not be, it might turn biased in the future as the data drifts, or as we get more input data, for example. At the moment, we may only have knowledge of, say, ethnicity, but we don't know anything about the gender of the customers that we're actually making these actions upon, right? So that might come later. We might be biased against gender, for example, right now without even realizing it. And maybe in a year or something, this particular enterprise might get that data in, and then they can test for that as well. So it's going to be an ongoing sort of iterative process with these sort of safeguards inside there. And bias is one of the key things you need to check for. Right. So, and this is what we actually did and we implemented. So when I say, I highlight the implementation because often fairness and AI ethics, they have a tendency to be just spoken about and to sort of die as value statements on a corporate web page, which is a horrible place to die. So if you can incorporate that in the actual on the ground, the coding and all that kind of thing as well in that MLOps process, then you can actually ensure that it is actually checked before it even goes in there. It becomes like a criteria, an acceptance criteria for the model to go live, right? So various things that end in royal commissions that I won't talk about because we're being recorded, those sort of things would be prevented because such models that are clearly biased against particular demographics would never go live. And then if they were originally not biased and then they drifted to become biased, the monitoring would actually be able to tell you when something has gone wrong and then be able to either pull the model or notify the team that developed it and all that kind of thing. So bias is a huge issue. And in the same framework, you can actually put in things like environmental impact, ecosystem impact, climate emissions, all these things like that can be treated in exactly the same way. So we as humans can set up guardrails for our AI models because the AI doesn't understand what it's doing. It has no clue. So we need the humans to actually put the barriers around it, say, you can go up to here, but no further, right? And that requires coders, it requires people to be able to think and to be able to bridge the gap between those sort of ethical sort of concepts and the actual coding itself.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so we're going to begin to wrap up the presentation and go straight into further questions. We just have some concluding remarks from the points that we've discussed today. And I believe what is apparent throughout the discussion is that we need to be intentionally weighing against the costs and use cases of energy and emissions. We need more informed dialogue. We're really grateful for everyone joining today. We can all educate ourselves and be more informed about this pressing issue. And of course, the overarching theme is really understanding the biosphere's fragility. And generally speaking as well, we do need to go beyond statistics and understand the energy requirements. And of course, it goes without saying, as Gareth has just alluded to, practicing transparency in all aspects of the AI lifecycle. Okay, Gareth, is there anything further to add on the concluding remarks before we open the floor up to the questions?
I think we should open it up as quickly as we can, given the time.
Brilliant. Okay, so we do have a few in the chat as well. What we haven't discussed, I do apologize, 1 second. So we had a question around how might we disincentivize profitable but environmentally harmful AI? We've talked about policy and some of the incentives, but do we have anything further about that?
Amusingly enough, I remember reading once The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and he actually had already inside there the social impacts. They used different phrasing, of course, at the time, but it was like the financial one, and then there was the social impacts. This is before they realized that there was an environment. I mean, they learned that quickly when they realized what they'd done to London. But I think that we actually need to factor that in, right? So whether it's through like things like a carbon tax or something along those lines, but I think that's a bit too limited. We need to actually know that, well, if we're going to impact biodiversity, right? The biosphere literally is our life support system as the human race. We haven't factored that in anywhere in our calculations. No one gets penalized for destroying that. We need to actually treat that. That's a fundamental problem, because humans are always, we will just go through with whatever, whatever KPI or whatever we've been given. We'll basically game the system so that we can get what we want and get our bonuses, right? So if we don't have that as part of it, we'll never solve the problem, basically. That's my opinion anyway.
Fantastic, thank you. Alison, do we have time for one more question? I do know it's 11 on the dot.
I mean, I'm enjoying this, so I'm happy to stick around if everyone else is still available. I'm actually curious, when Gareth was talking about, you choose to do it in this location rather than that location because you have the information about where that energy is coming from, where, this one is solar and that one is coal powered. But most of us don't have that knowledge. So do you think that there is a need for, I don't know that it would be a watchdog necessarily, but like the transparency that would enable the public to make those educated decisions, because we don't have that information.
You're absolutely right. I'd split that into two questions, right? So the first one was to do with the actual, I was using the context of like those hyperscalers, so AWS, GCP, and things like that. I personally use Google Cloud, and I know that they actually do, if you have a look at their data centers, you actually can see how much CO2 is emitted per compute and all that kind of thing. So I deliberately chose US Central One, which is based in Utah, which has got the best CO2 ones inside there. So I think pretty sure that AWS and Azure have the same sort of thing inside there. I just haven't checked recently, right? So those sort of ones, you can actually make that choice, but then that's a very niche sort of use case, right? So generally, there are some tools that are being developed. I know that, what's it called in Deloitte? Illuminate, right? Is for looking at supply chain, and they're trying to add in scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions inside there as well. Right. So that's the scope 1 and 2 for those. This audience probably knows, but it's, the emissions that you actually do yourself or indirectly. And then scope 3 are the stuff that basically your customers, for example, do. Right. So scope 3 will come out if you can collect their scope 1 and 2 data on those ones there. So they're trying to build a very large sort of network. They can already see it through ownerships and deals and things like that. So there are some tools emerging now that can help you to actually go, right, well, over here, it's more carbon emissions, but maybe they use child labor, for example, or various things like that. So that kind of data is starting to be pulled together, but you're right, it's extremely hard. There is some objective data starting to come through as well. So there's the I think it's CO2 or something. There's a particular satellite that NASA has put out, which looks for carbon dioxide emissions, and that actually can trace it down to the factory level, which means that there's going to be there's some space. Anyone who is a founder, there's space for being able to pinpoint where the factories are coming from using publicly available data. Google has got the Earth Observatory, I think they call it as well. There's a lot of data going inside there as well. I think that includes methane emissions and various other things like that. So it is starting, but I'm not a patient kind of person, so it's not fast enough, in my opinion.
And follow-up question, are we worried about greenwashing there, where once that information does become available, people will find ways to make themselves look more eco-friendly than they actually are?
Oh, yes. Yes, there's already cases we can point to right now of people doing that. Right? I'm not going to because I can see the recording button in the top left.
The irony of the chat bots just saying, "Hi, I'm an AI assistant helping take notes for this presentation." Yeah, I think the greenwashing topic as well, if we look at the phenomena, if you relate it back to the Gartner's hype cycle as well, in terms of if we look at the blockchain and cryptocurrency and the NFTs, we've all heard of scandals where there was a hype cycle. And I think in any given scenario, you're always going to have opportunists which are going to take advantage of a scenario. But if you are able to do your due diligence and understand their industry, then you can at least not fall victim to that. But sadly, I think that still will be the case.
But you do have a role for things like, I mean, I'm self-interested, of course, but you do have a role for places like Deloitte and the other big four consultings to basically have an independent view and collect the data across there, right? So in its perfect sense, that's where, the data can be stored there and made publicly available and things like that. Well, I'm sure we won't do it public. We'll probably put a price on it. But at least we can sort of collect it impartially and, get that data sort of surfaced and all that as well, and sort of validate that it hasn't been manipulated or anything, or we've got it from objective sources such as satellite data or sensors on the ground and all that kind of thing as well.
Well, and as we're talking about how AI is even in this conversation with Magdalena's assistant, Zoom has this AI companion option right in the toolbar now, and I think we can all agree that raging against the machine, quite literally, is not going to work. I know as someone who knows a lot of artists, there's been a lot of anger from that side as well, but I think we can all agree that it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere, and so we need to just figure out how we can do the best with it that we can.
Yeah. And there has been a lot of good work done in both watermarking and also detecting AI produced art as well. So because that is one where the IP and all that's still there's cases all over the place. It hasn't been decided or anything yet. But it is a huge issue. And
That's a
I
whole other
honestly, I'm not
webinar. That's not what we're here for.
exactly. Yes. Yeah. And even that webinar would not be resolved. We still don't even know the answer. And the best legal minds on the planet don't know the answer yet. So but yeah, you're right. Anytime you get a new technology, there's going to be winners and losers at the start, and it's going to get into a new sort of equilibrium, I guess you could say, with it. And at the moment, we're in a very chaotic sort of stage where we don't know what's happening. And then that's the AI stuff is happening at the same time, like Sophia mentioned, with the other potential catastrophes that we've actually got of like the climate and the biosphere and all those things like that. And yeah, various other threats that we've got in geopolitics.
Great. Well, did anyone else have any further questions, or shall we go ahead and wrap up? I think that silence means that we're okay to draw an end to this, but thank you both so much. I found this incredibly fascinating, and I get the impression that everyone else did as well. So thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Thanks a lot. See you next time.